Continuing to read on page 348, the strongest evidence for such a bias comes from a largely forgotten study performed by Sandra Scar and Richard Weinberg in 1976. Scar studied transracial adoptees, black children adopted by white parents, and found that these children had an average IQ of 106, at least as high as white children. By analyzing carefully performed controls, Scar concluded that intelligence was not being enhanced, but performance on particular subtests of intelligence. We cannot shrug this proposition away by suggesting that the current construction of the IQ test must be correct, since it predicts performance in the real world. Of course it does, because the concept of IQ is powerfully self-reinforcing. It measures a quality imbued with enormous meaning and value, whose job it is to propagate itself. The circle of its logic is perfectly closed and impenetrable, yet the actual configuration of the test is relatively arbitrary. You do not render the word intelligence meaningless by shifting the balance in a test from visuospatial perception to short-term recall, say, but you do shift the black-white IQ score discrepancy, and therein lies the rub. The tricky thing about the notion of G is that it pretends to be a biological quality that is measurable and heritable, while it is actually strongly determined by cultural priorities. This is a tricky thing about the notion of G, is that it pretends to be a biological quality that is measurable and heritable. But to some extent, of course, it is, while it is actually strongly determined by cultural priorities. But that certainly is the whole argument. It's both. It is, to simplify it somewhat, the most dangerous of all things, a meme masquerading as a gene. If the history of medical genetics teaches us one lesson, it is to be wary of precisely such slips between biology and culture. Humans, we now know, are largely similar in genetic terms, but with enough variation within us to represent true diversity. Or, perhaps more accurately, we are culturally or biologically inclined to magnify variations, even if they are minor in the larger scheme of the genome. Tests that are explicitly designed to capture variances in abilities will likely capture variances in abilities, and these variations may well track along racial lines. But to call the score in such a test intelligence, especially when the score is uniquely sensitive to the configuration of the test, is to insult the very quality it sets out to measure. Genes cannot tell us how to categorize or comprehend human diversity. Environments can, cultures can, geographies can, histories, that should have been geographies, can, histories can. Our language sputters in its attempt to capture this slip. When a genetic variation is statistically the most common, we call it normal, a word that implies not just superior statistical representation, but qualitative or even moral superiority. Merriam-Webster's dictionary has no less than 8 definitions of the word, including occurring naturally and mentally and physically healthy. When the variation is rare, it is termed a mutant, a word that implies not just statistical uncommonness, but qualitative inferiority or even moral repugnance. Well, sometimes that special characteristic is a superior rather than inferior quality. So Einstein, Euler, Newton, things of that sort. would we call them mutants? And so it does, interposing linguistic discrimination on genetic variation, mixing biology and desire. When a gene variant reduces an organism's fitness in a particular environment, a hairless man in Antarctica, we call the phenomenon genetic illness. When the same variant increases fitness in a different environment, we call the organism genetically enhanced. The synthesis of evolutionary biology and genetics reminds us that these judgments are meaningless. Enhancement or illness are words that measure the fitness of a particular genotype to a particular environment. If you alter the environment, the words can even reverse their meanings. When nobody read, the psychologist Alison Gopnik writes, dyslexia wasn't a problem. When most people had to hunt, a minor genetic variation in your ability to focus attention was hardly a problem, and may even have been an advantage, enabling a hunter to maintain his focus on multiple and simultaneous targets, for instance. When most people have to make it through high school, the same variation can become a life-altering disease. Last section of the chapter. The desire to categorize humans along racial lines, and the impulse to superpose attributes such as intelligence or criminality, creativity, or violence on those lines illustrates a general theme concerning genetics and categorization. Like the English novel or the face, say, the human genome can be lumped or split in a million different ways. But whether to split or lump, to categorize or synthesize, is a choice. When a distinct heritable biological feature such as a genetic illness, that is sickle cell anemia, is the ascendant concern, then examining the genome to identify the locus of that feature makes absolute sense. The narrower the definition of the heritable feature or the trait, the more likely we will find a genetic locus for the trait, and the more likely the trait will segregate within some human subpopulation, Ashkenazi Jews in the case of Tay-Sachs disease, or Afro-Caribbeans for sickle cell anemia. There's a reason that marathon running, for instance, is becoming a genetic sport. Runners from Kenya and Ethiopia, a narrow eastern wedge of one continent, dominate the race, not just because of talent and training, but also because the marathon is a narrowly defined test for a certain form of extreme fortitude. Genes that enable this fortitude, for example, particular combinations of gene variants that produce distinct forms of anatomy, physiology, and metabolism, will be naturally selected. How is that not an example of the value of intelligence as Murray and Hertzstein describe it in the bell curve? That seems like a counterexample to Mukherjee's argument to me. Conversely, the more we widen the definition of a feature or trait, say intelligence or temperament, the less likely that the trait will correlate with single genes. I'm not familiar with the idea that a single gene does make that correlation in any of the works, and by extension with races, tribes, or subpopulations. Intelligence and temperament are not marathon races. Well, they can be. There are no fixed criteria for success. Well, but there is. No start or finish lines. Yes, there are. And running sideways or backward might secure victory. Well, if that's part of the race. The narrowness or breadth of the definition of a feature is, in fact, a question of identity.